here to talk about the Gospel of Thomas again. So last time in the previous video, I tried to show how some of the things in the Gospel of Thomas are meant to be parallel to the things we find in our texts. Now, meant to. How they got in the form they did is a complete debate, but if we're going to compare, then we have to be willing to sort of allow the translation to be fast and loose. And there are times where we say, I'm not sure this is just a translation game here. There seems to be some sort of shift in meaning that has taken place. And of course, what we really want to get to is there a shift in meaning that drastically changes what's being said about Jesus or Jesus' teachings? Is this in some way heretical? Is it especially Gnostic, as it's often claimed to be? Well, let me open us up just by having to explain how difficult the question about something being Gnostic has become. You see, if you were to take a sort of standard class on what it means to be a Gnostic, you would read in a textbook somewhere a list of attributes. Gnostics believe these things, 5, 7, however many there are. But when you actually go look at Gnostic texts like ones found at Nag Hammadi that we've discovered that we would call Gnostic, you start to realize that none of them ever quite fit perfectly the definition and description of Gnosticism that the textbooks give it. Instead, today scholars think of Gnosticism as a wide, diverse movement, and maybe even we should get rid of the idea of such a thing as Gnosticism. If you could shift that sort of capital G Gnosticism, instead think in terms of little g, Gnostic, as an adjective, well then what does it mean to believe in a secret gnosis? After all, in the early chapters of Mark, even Jesus tells his disciples he's teaching in parables and secrets so that people won't believe and won't understand. If you think that Gnostics have this secret that has Jesus in a different view altogether, where he's not quite tangible and material, well, the problem there is finding any Gnostic text that actually teaches that. There's just all sorts of difficulties in pinning down this idea. And even in this gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, there are some times where we'll see it looks like it might be leaning in that little g Gnostic direction. Does it ever cross the line? Does it ever become heretical? But as we're going to see, it's not quite as simple as we once thought. Several scholars have looked at this text, and if you take each saying, each logion, you could read it in a critical light and see it as very heretical and pushing toward Gnosticism. Or you could read it in a sympathetic light, and it might be saying something perfectly ordinary for Christians at this time. Now, why would one want to sympathize with the text or criticize the text? That's a bigger question. But what I think will help is if we just look at a few key examples and decide which way makes more sense, and we might see that it could be read in either direction. Okay, let's start with an example that I think really gets to the point here. In saying 28, Jesus says, "And I took my stand in the midst of the world, and in flesh I appeared to them." Now, this, in a quick read, just clearly seems to show that this is a text that's Gnostic. Jesus isn't really in the flesh. He appeared to them that way. That's the critical read. Or maybe it's actually saying he appeared in the flesh. This text may not be trying to get rid of the flesh of Jesus and have some Gnostic, docetic view of Jesus. It might simply be a casual use of this language, not even worried about sounding heretical. He's in the flesh, and in the flesh, he appeared to the world. Now, which is the right answer? This is where you can have one opinion or the other, and it's hard to know which is right. Let's take another example. In saying 3, Jesus tells his disciples, "Look, the kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you." Now, at the beginning, this doesn't really seem to be all that controversial, but when you pair it with some other statements in this text, some would wonder, is this some sort of Gnostic, pantheistic way of looking at God? Some sources tell us that the Gnostics view God as having all these emanations come off God. This is much like a Platonic philosophical view of the world, where one emanation was a copy of a copy of a copy, and eventually these emanations get so far away from God that they're not very godly or divine at all. In fact, they fall so far from God that this world is made up of much lower substances than the deity. Now, in that way of thinking, is God sort of oozing out through and in everything? If so, maybe this is a text that's endorsing that or assuming that. And you see, Jesus is a Gnostic here. He's telling everybody that the kingdom is within you and without you. It's everywhere. It's in the flowers and the trees. Well, maybe. That's the critical reading. But that's asking a lot of this one little saying. What Jesus will say, even to his own disciples, like in Luke 17, is that the kingdom of God is among you, or you could translate within you, within us, the people of God. So maybe it's not so foreign to Jesus to say things like this, that the kingdom is within you, and it's also bigger than you, it's beyond you. That's the sympathetic reading. Which is right? It's hard to say. Let's take another example. Going along the same lines, if you looked at the text where Jesus famously says, "Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." I say famous because this is one of the more well-known lines from this text. And it could be argued that this is another form of pantheism. You see, split the rocks, split the trees. Jesus is in everything. His spirit pervades everything. Some sort of way in which God has oozed out into all the world, and all the world in a way has droplets of light in it, sparks of divinity. And so everywhere you look, you could find Jesus in this Gnostic view. Well, that's a critical way of reading this text, and it may be right. But there is an argument to be made here. Scholars have made this argument that this is not so sinister and not so unorthodox or unusual at all. Let's take a look again at what the words actually say, especially allowing for what we showed in the previous video, how many translations this has gone through. Let's see what this text could simply be pointing to. Notice that it says, Jesus says, "Split a piece of wood." Now, that's a translation choice, even all the way down to the English translator. What if instead of saying split a piece of wood, the verb is meant to be something like cross a piece of wood? Now, for Jesus to say, cross a piece of wood and I am there, that's a perfectly Christian affirmation. Look again at what the text says about the rock. In our translation, it says, "Lift up the stone, and you will find me." Is Jesus hiding under a rock? Well, again, knowing how many translations this has gone through, what if we said it in a more sort of biblically familiar verb? What if we said, "Roll away the stone, and you will find me"? Now suddenly this is an affirmation of the resurrection, of the empty tomb. Move the stone away and you'll see Jesus isn't there. He's not hiding under the rock. You found the resurrected Christ. Now, which is right? That sort of sympathetic view I just gave you, or that more critical view that finds this heretical? It's anyone's guess as to which one is the more certain reading. You see, because these are just sayings, it's hard to know for sure. Okay, I'll take one more. And this one I like because it's not so clearly heretical as it is just really difficult to understand what it could mean. This is from Saying 7. And there Jesus says, "Lucky is the lion that the human will eat." And I'm just going to go ahead and remind us, if we were allowing for this to be a parallel, there is no parallel with our Bible, our canonical Gospels, for this saying. But if there were, we would translate this more familiarly. We would say, "Blessed is the lion that the human will eat," so that the lion becomes human. And foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion still will become human. Now, what does that mean? Here's the answer. Nobody knows what that means. There is no commentary given with this text to explain what Jesus could possibly mean to say something like this. Who knows if Jesus really said it, and this is an honest memory of his saying, and then later Christians couldn't understand it at all, so it just gets dropped out of other Gospels. Or who knows if this is some later weird mumbo-jumbo made up by some evil, wicked heretic who decided to put strange, mystical sayings in the mouth of Jesus. It's possible. It's anybody's guess. Now, I just wanted to review. I mean, if we have already seen other cases where sayings could be taken a sort of sinister, heretical way, or they could be taken in a perfectly ordinary, orthodox way, well, that should give us license to look at a saying like this and ask which side makes sense. Maybe to say that blessed is the lion that the human will eat, in early Christianity, there are a lot of statements about the fact that people eat Jesus' body and blood. And if we think of a lion in biblical terms, who are we supposed to think of? The Lion of Judah, of course, Aslan. Maybe this is a text about the Eucharist, about communion, the Lord's Supper. Blessed is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human, as if enfleshed in us in some way. But then it goes on to say, foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion will still become human. Maybe this is saying that if you don't have a part in Jesus' flesh and blood, as Jesus says in John 6, then you will receive the judgment of the lion. You will stand before the Lion of Judah and be condemned. But the lion will still become human. Now, I'm not sure if that's what's meant by this text. I don't think anybody knows what's meant by this text, because this is a saying. And whether it ever went back to the original, to Jesus himself, or whether it's added in at some later time, like it very well may be, well, who knows? We're simply left with these sorts of statements that we have to try to figure out, try to discern. Well, those are some of the key examples of how this could be heretical or not heretical. Next, let's just look at some, maybe we should call them problematic texts that appear in this text, and they definitely appear to be problematic. Okay, before we leave this text, I would be remiss if I didn't at least address a couple of passages that I call problematic, but they certainly need explaining. In two passages, there is a statement about people taking their clothes off and prancing around. And you'd almost want to laugh at that, except this statements involve children, and you just can't leave this alone. You have to ask, wait, is there something really sinister going on here? I mean, after all, some Gnostics were accused of just throwing out all morals because it doesn't matter what you do in the flesh, so you could just get away with anything. Well, if you look closely at these texts, I don't think that's what this is saying. Jesus has two statements that I'll read for you. One is in statement 21, where he refers to the disciples being like children, and they take off their clothes and demand their field to come back. Now, why are children like that? Well, here's a lengthier statement in verse 37. Jesus said to them, "When you strip without being ashamed, and you take your clothes and put them under your feet like children and trample them, then you will see the Son of the Living One, and you will not be afraid." Now, to us today, this seems to be treading on ground that's just unthinkable, unspeakable. But let's just at least try to acknowledge where in the Bible, what sort of imagery might be alluded to here. After all, there is one clear time in the Bible where it's okay to be naked. You're supposed to be naked and unafraid. It's okay for Adam and Eve, in a very childlike state, to have no clothes on at all. And in biblical sort of imagery, we're promised that we'll be restored to paradise. Not quite in the same way. I don't know. I assume we'll have clothes on in the next life. But this text seems to be assuming something like that. Jesus is promising a return to that state of innocence. This is probably not something sinister at all, although it's incredibly confusing to us to read something like this. Okay, let me take another one that's only slightly less problematic or less difficult for us to talk about. It's in the very last statement found in this text, in saying 1:14. There we read where Simon Peter said to the other disciples, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven." Okay, there you have it. Apparently, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says that for Mary to make it into heaven, Mary has to become man. More patriarchy, more male chauvinism. We knew this was in the early church. Not surprised, just kind of surprised. Someone would put it in the mouth of Jesus so boldly, right? Looks like sinister, if not heretical, unacceptable kind of treatment of women. Well, that very well may be what's going on here, but a lot of scholars have actually come to question this line. In some editions, it's actually put in brackets and said to not be original to the text. Now, some of that is because some scholars want us to have this sympathetic view of the Gnostics and of texts like this, as I've been trying to communicate. And so this text doesn't quite fit with any sort of group that we would sympathize with. I mean, there are Gnostic texts that seem actually very sympathetic toward women, very open toward women's leadership. And so how would this text fit with that? So it probably isn't there. And the real evidence that helps that case is earlier in this own text, Jesus refers to the way that men and women are really equal, as if there is neither male nor female. Well, if this text is added later, that is a little easier to explain. But what if it's not added later? After all, there's no manuscript where this is missing. It's conjecture. It's an educated guess to say this was a later edition. So what are we going to do with it if it was original? Well, here we go. On the one hand, the critical side, we just look and say this is an example of patriarchy in the ancient world. No surprise, people thought Jesus talked like this. The other hand, this could mean exactly the opposite. There was a wave of feminist readings of this text that, unsurprisingly, was critical of this text. And then there was a wave of feminist readings that found this text, and others like it, to actually be sympathetic toward women, to be pro-women. And the way that you would ever think that from reading this text is to simply place it in the context of the ancient world. It's no surprise the ancient world thought that men were superior to women, men were stronger than women, etc., etc. And if you go back and look at ancient texts in general about women, the whole ancient world sort of thinks in this kind of hierarchy. I mean, it's Aristotle, when he's defining what it means to be man, to be human in his language, he sort of defines us as all of our parts, all the things that make us human. We're a political animal. We're separated from the other animals. That's what makes a human. Next paragraph, Aristotle tells you what it means to be a woman. And the implication is, because a woman's not fully human, a man is a human, and a woman is sort of a lesser being. And if you go read what Aristotle has to say, he's clear on that. Well, that's not Jesus who's defined male as superior to female. That's the ancient world. And so, according to this more sympathetic read, maybe even though Peter and all these other disciples want Mary to be out because she's female, she's lesser and doesn't deserve the kingdom, Jesus is actually saying, no, I'm going to make her equal to you males. And she too, even though she's a woman, will have a part in the kingdom. Maybe the point is she'll be neither identified as female and she'll be no less inferior than you males. No. That's a sympathetic reading. Maybe a little forced. Maybe it still says that Mary has to become male, and so maybe there's a valid criticism here. It's hard to know. And we're going to see several texts like this. There are multiple texts in the ancient church where you have women who suddenly appear as men, or at least have to dress like men. And there's a big question about women's roles and how equality was understood or could have even been conceived in the ancient world. So we'll get to talk about that in other texts we read and other videos where we come back to this. But for now, hopefully that at least gives you some context, some frame in which to put that saying 114, and to admit, texts like this have their problems, and we should have our concerns, and we should be really careful in scrutinizing them. But sometimes there are ways, at least, to better understand them and to have them explained to us. Okay, I think that about does it for the Gospel of Thomas. Now, after we've looked at all those examples, the big question is, what do we do with a text like this? Remember, I said that some are trying to find authentic words of Jesus in this text. And it's possible, but it's a tough challenge to prove something like that. And beyond that, people of faith are not going to take this kind of text at face value compared to how they would take their canonical Gospels. As a matter of faith, you take these as inspired and of God and as reliable and trustworthy. Whereas the Gospel of Thomas is in a different category altogether. We looked at it as if we were historians. How would we compare the two? And I think if we would be willing to say, even if we're not looking for the words of Christ, we do have a good, helpful glimpse into how some Christians thought Jesus talked and taught. And that's really more of what we really want to get into. We want to read some other texts that will give us more glimpses of how early Christians thought about Jesus and how to live out their Christian life. In the next few texts we'll read, the good news is they will have more than just sayings. If you pay attention, many of them do quote the sayings of our Lord. And we're never quite sure, is it a gospel or a sayings gospel like Q or Thomas or just oral tradition? But the good news is, in addition to some sayings of our Lord, they also have other material. They have Paul's letters. They have the whole, what will soon be called the Old Testament. And so when we look at those other texts, we'll see more of a more filled out picture. We'll get better glimpses into what Christian life was like in this early period. So I hope you'll come back and watch those as well.
Declaration, then I say